Okay, so this video is going to be about phantom limbs, and you may have already heard of phantom limbs, but it's a condition where someone who has had a body part removed, like say an arm or a leg amputated, will afterward continue to have experiences where they feel as if the limb is still there, where they have phantom perceptions of the limb that can be very vivid. Now, it's not a delusion. It doesn't have a break from reality or anything. No one thinks the arm is literally there, but it feels like it's there. It's a perceptual issue. So this happens actually to most people with an amputation. Somewhere around 80 to maybe 100% at some point have some phantom sensation for the limb, and most people have a pretty distinct, pretty vivid phantom limb. Now, maybe that by itself wouldn't be a very big deal, but a lot of people also have what's called phantom limb pain. The phantom can feel like it's paralyzed and distorted in a weird and painful position, like it's having clenching spasms but can't move, like it's shorter than before. And this pain, it can be worse when you're stressed or anxious, or sometimes even depending on the weather. It can be bad enough it's actually driven people to suicide. And often, pain medication doesn't help much. One of the classic treatments has been opioids. But opioids like morphine, even though they've been used and sometimes can help for a while, there are obviously side effects to long-term opioid use, long-term morphine use. Local anesthetic has been tried after the surgery, like right after the amputation surgery. That doesn't seem to help. So the question is, what causes this lasting, sometimes for years and years at a time, this lasting chronic phantom limb pain in a lot of people who have amputations? Well, people had noticed and mentioned phantom limb pain throughout history, but the term itself didn't show up until just after the Civil War in the late 1800s, when there had been a lot of amputations. At that time, there was a kind of straightforward explanation for the phantom limb pain that some of these amputees were feeling. They figured the surgery must have damaged some of those nerves out there where the amputation occurred, out in the peripheral part of the body, the peripheral nervous system. We've got all those nociceptive neurons out in the arm sending axons up toward the brain. So if you amputate the arm, those axons are getting damaged. And that must be what causes the pain, they figured. In other words, they assumed the pain was caused purely by the neurons out there in the peripheral nervous system. So when pain meds weren't really helping people, they would do what's called a stump revision. In other words, they'd go back and amputate more of the limb or do surgery on the nerves out there. They tried to figure out it must be something at the tip there, at the residual limb where the amputation had occurred. But that generally doesn't help people. Likewise, common treatments for decades have included trying antidepressants, trying spinal cord stimulation, using biofeedback, and frankly, stuff just doesn't work all that well. Now, even in the 1980s, pretty recently, by about the 1980s, that Ronald Melzack guy we talked about before, who helped invent the gait control model, Ronald Melzack had speculated that maybe phantom limbs aren't entirely peripheral in origin, but central, meaning that the central nervous system, the brain. Why? Because he noticed that some people who were born without any limbs, that's a congenital condition, some people just get born without any limbs, but some of them still experience phantom limbs. In fact, it's surprisingly common. So there's no amputation involved there, no surgery that would have cut or damaged any of their nociceptors, and yet those patients still had phantoms. So around the same time, or a little after that, there was some work on monkeys in the 90s, just basic research work from neuroscientists that showed that if you cut the wires going from one of the sensory systems out in the peripheral nervous system on its way to the central nervous system, if you cut some of those wires, like if you cut off the input from a sensory system into the brain, then the brain starts to do some cortical reorganization. Some neuroplasticity happens. This is some of the early research in sensory neuroplasticity. Okay, so given that stuff was kind of rolling around in the scientific literature in the late 80s and into the 90s, this guy from, I think he's in UC San Diego now, this guy named Villanor Ramachandran came up with a hypothesis that maybe phantom limbs are coming from reorganization and plasticity up there in S1 in the primary somatosensory cortex. In other words, maybe it's a brain issue related to that homunculus, that body map that we've got up in S1. And he found some initial evidence of that. Remember the layout of the homunculus we saw before? The neurons that happen to represent or fire for touches to certain parts of the body, all in a nice map there, right? Some being exaggerated, certainly. But notice that the neurons representing our hands are pretty close to the neurons representing our face area, right? They kind of border each other there in the brain. Well, Ramachandran found in an early article back then, when he would stroke part of an arm amputee's face, so someone who had their arm amputated and was experiencing an arm phantom limb, he would do a little brush, just a little kind of paintbrush on different parts of their face. And on some parts, people would say, oh, that I'm feeling a touch on my phantom arm, on various parts of my phantom arm when you touch various parts of my face. And in a very non-random manner. It's kind of systematic and consistent, and even consistent across different phantom patients. Because again, those neurons have a similar layout in everyone's somatosensory homunculus. So he gives an example of how phantom limb pain, the pain part of this might come about. Imagine, for example, someone in the military has a bad injury to their arm, okay? It might initially be that before the amputation, there's a little while where the arm is in a sling or a cast. It's immobilized, or maybe it's even paralyzed from the damage, right? The motor neuron's also damaged, and likely very painful, right? So during that time, if the person tries to move their arm, it's like their brain's sending out a signal saying, move. And the response or the feedback that the brain gets a moment later is no, or ouch. Right? And the next time they try to move their arm, the motor cortex is going to send down a signal saying, move. And the arm sends back a signal, says, no, ouch. Right? Move. No, ouch. Move. No, ouch. And in essence, through neuroplasticity, the brain representation of that limb starts to represent it as being in pain, as immobile or stuck paralyzed in this awkward and painful position. That then would become part of the homuncular body map up there in S1. So Ramachandran actually had a really clever idea for a new treatment. And brilliantly, this treatment only costs a few dollars and can be done at home, and there are no real side effects. It's totally safe. It's not like getting someone addicted to opioids to help their pain. His idea was, if the cortical representation of the limb is what's all messed up, but there's no input to that part of the cortex that could update it and improve the representation in the brain, because there aren't any neurons in the non-existing arm to send those new signals, right? Then he figured he needed another way to send new information, new input to the brain to update that neural representation of the limb. And the easiest way, totally non-invasive, that he came up with would be to send info about the limb through another sensory system. Because certainly in our brain, all the sensory systems do eventually connect, right? Initially, touch signals go to S1, initially visual signals go to V1, but those areas then do send wires further into the brain. They connect with each other. They give feedback to each other. They take input. They combine multisensory input. So his idea was actually to use what now is called a mirror box. This is sometimes called mirror box therapy, or just mirror therapy today. Basically, the person sits in front of a mirror, often placed in a box, kind of like this one. So they're sitting in front of it, sticking their arms through the sides, and they put their good hand, the one that still is intact, in front of the reflective side of the mirror. And then they stick their residual limb, right, the amputated limb, behind the mirror on the other side. It's out of view, especially if the mirror is tall enough, then it's out of view. They can't actually see the missing limb anymore. What you do is you have the person kind of tilt their head toward the mirror side, and they look into the mirror. So during this treatment, they are looking in the mirror at the reflection. They're looking at the mirror itself, so they cannot see the actual amputated part that's hidden behind the mirror. They don't see the missing part, but instead they're seeing a reflection of their good hand, which is right where the amputated hand would be if it still existed, right? It's almost like you're looking through the mirror at your amputated hand, but it's back, right? So in essence, then what they're told is basically hover your phantom over here behind the mirror, but then do this while looking at the mirror, and it'll visually look like seeing their hand all whole again, thanks to the reflection. Now, obviously, this alone won't do much. They know that their hand's still behind the mirror and like that it's missing, right? They know it's just the phantom back there. But the key is, here's where we start reprogramming the brain. The key is then the person is told to move their real limb and to try moving, to imagine moving, to kind of send the motor signal out to move their phantom limb on opposite sides of the mirror, but in ways that are synchronous, that match up, that are symmetrical. Like move both hands up at the same time, move them down a little bit at the same time, squeeze both hands into a ball at the same time, poke out your index finger on both hands at the same time, wave them symmetrically, kind of like a conductor, right? But on each side of the mirror, all while they're looking just at that one side of the mirror, seeing the reflection through it. And of course, the person may initially complain. They may say, doctor, my phantom is paralyzed, right? It doesn't move. But you just tell them, just try it anyway. Try to imagine it. Try to move it. Send the command. So their motor cortex is sending out a signal that says, move. But here's the crazy part. For the somatosensory pathway, it may not get any new updated information about the situation because the arm's not there, right? It doesn't move. But for the visual pathway, because we did this trick with the mirror, for the visual pathway, we are suddenly getting some visual feedback, some sensory feedback going back to the brain. The brain said, move, and vision now says, it moved. Look, see it move? Because as we'll see later, all the sensory systems do share their information with each other. So visual feedback of where your body is, where your limbs are and its movement, that does act as an input to that somatotopic representation of your body up there in the parietal lobe. It's just a more indirect route, but it's still a sensory route to that. So if the patients do this mirror movement for a while, all while looking at the reflection, getting those visual signals that the phantom is moving around again, many people start reporting that the previously paralyzed and painful phantom feels like it's moving, like it's not as paralyzed, not clenched anymore, and the pain often decreases or may even go away over time, especially if they do this mirror thing a couple times a day for a few weeks. In fact, sometimes the phantom itself will start to shrink, what we call telescoping. Like the phantom hand gets closer and closer to the residual limb, or if they had, cut off at the shoulder, then suddenly they'll feel like there's fingers just sticking out of their shoulder instead of this whole long phantom limb being there. Sometimes the phantom limb may disappear entirely. Now, this doesn't work for everyone, but it seems pretty damn promising. So Ramachandran came up with this idea back in the 90s, but there wasn't much systematic or controlled clinical research into the treatment until the 2010s or so. And by, I think it was in 2018, around 2018, a big review of the methodologically sound trials. In other words, the trials that weren't sloppy, that were done well. Looking at those trials, and there were maybe 15 or so that met those qualifications, that suggested it is effective. Mirror treatment is effective in reducing the pain. So it's now finally starting to be used more commonly in treatment settings and rehab and occupational therapy. And you can see how easily it's extended to phantom leg pain as well as arms. And well, phantoms can occur for other amputated body parts. People get phantom eyes after their eye is removed for eye cancer, or people get phantom breasts after a mastectomy. People will have phantom penises after a pinectomy. I don't think they found a way to extend mirror therapy to those specifically, but theoretically, virtual reality and other techniques to feed false sensory input to the brain might help. And so people have been looking into virtual reality for this stuff as well. And sometimes that's the version of mirror therapy we use. We just do it in virtual reality instead. It's also been used to treat people, or at least are experimenting with seeing whether mirror therapy can be used for other situations like stroke rehabilitation, things like that, where it might help to get kind of this restarting of input to the brain, because those are brain issues. At any rate, why the case of phantom limb pain is so interesting and important is it shows us a type of pain that is not just nociceptors firing, because no skin exists where the pain is felt in phantom limb pain. You're feeling pain out in the world where your body isn't even there. And it's just a brain thing. So, and we see that shutting down the neural pathway from the spine to the brain, that doesn't remove phantom limb pain. Doing those stump revisions doesn't remove it. So phantom pain seems to be at least partly, maybe largely, created in the brain. And understanding the somatotopic map, the homunculus map of our body up in S1, and the neuroplasticity that's involved in its reorganization over time, that helps us find clever new ways to help people who are suffering from a very real condition that for a long time people just wrongly assume was damaged wires at the location of the amputation. As I mentioned before, experiments with monkeys were what actually initially suggested this neuroplasticity, this cortical reorganization. And it's been confirmed through a lot of other research since then, in animal models especially, but also in humans. So changing the input to the brain eventually changes how much cortex is devoted to that body part. And imaging studies using like fMRI brain imaging in live healthy humans have also supported this quite extensively in humans. And we'll see that in a future topic. Now, meanwhile, if you want to experience a little bit of mirror therapy effect for yourself, but don't happen to have phantom limb, don't worry. You can actually use a mirror to do a similar trick with your existing limbs and get a pretty trippy little experience, just messing with your brain for fun. So basically, find a mirror, or maybe you have one of the right size in your bathroom that kind of swings out so you can put your hands on both sides. And then once you got that mirror, sit or stand in front of it. And, you know, if it's just a freestanding mirror, you may need to prop it up or have a friend hold it up, right? So that you can sit or stand in front of it and put your hands on both sides, and you'll tilt your head a little bit towards the reflective side so you can watch the reflection the whole time. Always look at the reflection during the demo, just like they have to do during the mirror therapy. Then what you do is basically what the phantom limb patients do. You put one hand on each side of the mirror, so one is hidden behind it, and then you'll make little movements totally symmetrically, like squeeze both hands in the same way at the same time or in the same rhythm. Snap your fingers on both sides at the same time. Wiggle your index finger in the same way on both hands at the same time. Or wave just a little bit in and out like a conductor on both sides. Again, keep it totally symmetrically, but the whole time do it so you're tilted and looking at the mirror. You're watching the reflection in the mirror. You shouldn't be seeing the hidden hand on the other side. Rather, you're just seeing the reflection and your good hand. Do this for about 1 minute. It's all it takes. Do it for about 1 minute where you're making these different symmetric matching actions. That means while you're doing that, your vision and your proprioception signals are all aligned. They're all matching up. When your hidden hand is moving up and your joints and muscles say it's moving up, then of course the reflection is also moving up. Everything is aligned. Then for the fun part of this experiment, when you're ready, what you'll do is just move your hands in an opposite way. Like after you did that warm up for a minute, just move them, like move one hand up and the other one down. Or squeeze one on the reflected side and open the one that's hidden behind the mirror. Or stick one finger out and keep the other hand balled in a fist. Again, all while watching the reflection. If you do this, most people have a very weird experience, and it feels all wonky and wrong for a moment because your hidden hand feels like it's moving downward, for example, right? Because it literally is, but you see it in the reflection moving upward. So the two senses are sending conflicting info to the brain about where your hand is. Vision is saying, my hand's up here, but your joints and muscles are saying, my hand's down here. That's what makes for a trippy feeling. It's a fun experience, like a fun little trick you can do at home. You can then go back to doing synchronized movements for 15 or 30 seconds, and it'll feel normal again. Everything's normal. And then repeat the fun. Just do the opposite movements again. So you can do this for a while and have this weird experience. It's actually a preview of some effects we'll talk about later in the course, where in a laboratory experiment, for example, we might make the sensory systems disagree with each other in artificial laboratory circumstances to see how the brain reconciles that, to better understand how the brain normally integrates information across the different senses. By the way, humans aren't the only ones who seem to experience phantoms. Well, it's hard to prove what the cat's perceptual inner experience is, and this could just be habitual motor routines. I think it's fair to conclude that other animals having brains with somatosensory cortexes and little homunculuses or feline munculuses, just like our brains, they probably do have phantom limb perceptions. You can see the cat here that has recently had an amputation to its left forelimb seems to be trying to use it to scratch the litter, or thinking it's scratching the litter with it. Okay, I'll end this video here, but in the next video, I want to mention a couple more things about this idea that pain is in the brain, and then we'll talk a little about the placebo effect.